Welcome everybody to today's session on the future of payment systems in South Africa. We are working in partnership with the presidency, specifically Rudy Dix's unit and Saul Musker working with Kate Phillip. This is a partnership with the World Bank as well as CBPEP and GTAC. We're also funded by the European Union, by SECO, and also the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And a lot of this work is actually anchored in the G2P program within the World Bank. For those of you that were able to join 2 weeks ago, we had a few technical hiccups with that session, but we've managed to remedy a lot of that. So we're really excited to see you all here. We're really focused on the next generation or the future of payments and what G2P payments look like. And the important point that we take from that is that we're looking at how we would digitize and automate payments in the public sector, but not just in the public sector, in the country more broadly. And in that, we're looking at government-to-person payments, but also person-to-government payments, but then person-to-business. Are far-reaching in the economy, and they would really improve access to finance and the speed at which payments can actually be made, the accuracy with which they can also be made, as well as the quality. Today, we're actually going to focus on next generation payment systems, and we're going to start off with some insights and lessons learned from Georgina Marin from the G2P program at the World Bank. And here we're just going to look at what options are available and the different core elements of payment systems, infrastructure, etc. And also the experience to date. On the next slide, we're going to listen to 2 case studies, one from Bangladesh and one from Indonesia, where we've got a CGAP and a World Bank expert. So Ms. Sylvia Bauer-Yazbek will be taking us through the Bangladesh case study, where there are a lot of lessons that South Africa can learn from that process. And then we've also got Mr. Gedi Putrarsana, who's going to take us through the case study for Indonesia, where we're looking at account issuers and potentially non-financial agent networks for payments. And then we're going to try and increase the amount of time that we have for discussion. So we've increased the time compared to last time session to 45 minutes, so we can have a much more interactive session. I see quite a few colleagues from various government institutions, etc. So we're hoping that you can actually exploit the opportunity to learn from the experts as far as possible. So just to give you a heads up, we will go through this again. We've got the rest of the payment series up for you to see. So the next one is on the 6th of October in about a fortnight. We were actually going to look at lessons on G2P payments in South Africa, and we're looking at end-to-end solutions regarding that. So we're going to explore SAS's R350 grant and how they've had to pivot and automate the process quite intensively. We're also going to listen to Clinton Harmon, who's going to talk to us a little bit about payments that were applied using a voucher system in the agricultural sector specifically, and then also potentially some other online systems that have been developed in South Africa. On the 20th of October, we will look at data standards and their use in data stacks. So it's important from a data interoperability perspective. It has been a challenge for us in recent times, but we're working on it, and we've seen significant improvements since COVID actually started. And then we've obviously got the session on the 3rd of November, which looks at digitization of the public sector, where we look at governance, public financial management and procurement arrangements, which is also a very important thing for us. A beneficiary-centric design approach for payments. We've got hopefully an interdepartmental fintech working group hackathon, but we're trying to see, what we're going to design around that. And then finally, we've got integrated databases for coordinated service delivery. So with that, I'm going to remind you about meeting etiquette. Just so that please keep your mics on silent if you don't mind. If you can mute, please raise your hand if you want to say something. If you can't raise your hand and you don't know where the feature is, please just type it in the chat and just say, I'd like to ask a question, and we'll certainly call you in. Please, by all means, put comments and any questions that you have in the chat as well. So, Georgina, over to you. I'm not going to really give you too much of a background because I'd rather like to hear from you if you don't mind. You can give us a very brief introduction about yourself in like 2 sentences, and then we will flight your slides over to you, Georgina. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Kathy. Can you hear me?
Yes, Georgina, loud and clear.
Perfect. Thank you. So my name is Georgina Marin, and I'm a program officer with the G2PX initiative at the World Bank, where we focus on the digitization of G2P programs for development outcomes. Before working with the G2PX initiative, I was working with the global team on responsible financial access and payment systems at the World Bank as well, on projects across Latin America, Africa, and East Asia. And before then, I was an economist at the Central Bank of Mexico. So today, I want to focus the presentation on giving you an overview of what we consider a modern G2P architecture at the G2PX initiative, and provide some high-level examples of what some of the building blocks behind a more modern G2P architecture could look like. I will also share a little bit of the lessons that we've learned so far from the COVID response. And I will start out with an overview of what are some of the benefits of digitizing government payments and why we think it's such a priority within a country's agenda. So just to dive right in, we know that there are countries around the world, including South Africa, that have digitized their government-to-person payments to some extent. The caveat is that there's evidence that shows that digitizing is not enough to improve the user experience and the impact that could be achieved. For instance, if you're digitizing government payments only at the back end or with not fully functional accounts, then while providers might be receiving the payments through digital means, the recipient in the end might be receiving the payments in cash or on a payment instrument that cannot be used to make digital transfers. And in this case, there's a missed opportunity. And let me dive a little bit deeper into why there's a missed opportunity. So we know from the literature that there are potential benefits that come from digitizing government-to-person payments, namely improving recipients' welfare, which includes financial inclusion. There's a wealth of evidence in the literature about having accounts as a gateway to other financial services, such as savings, insurance, remittances, payments, and credit. And we also know that there's a big opportunity to include the poorest in the country into the financial sector by digitizing government-to-person payments. What's important here is that it's not opening just accounts for beneficiaries, but looking at how to create that ecosystem so these accounts are useful for beneficiaries and they can actually reap all the benefits that come from accessing an account. We also know that there's a possibility to strengthening the path to women's economic empowerment by increasing their bargaining power, higher mobility, and even better nutrition when beneficiaries have access to financial accounts. Finally, there's the potential of recipient convenience. And this is when payments are digitized and well-designed, they can reduce the time that beneficiaries can have to wait to receive their payments. They can also lower the costs in terms of the collection time and the travel costs to the pickup place. Finally, there are government-wide fiscal savings that can be achieved through digitizing payments. And this ranges from lower disbursement costs, which South Africa is an example of, to savings due to cutting incorrect payments when cross-GP payments are digitized, and reducing leakages and corruptions through digital payments. So in the G2PX initiative, looking at all these potential benefits that there are of digitizing government payments, what we want to focus on is moving from program-specific efficiency gains, so designing digital payments just for a specific program efficiency, to thinking about how to create financial inclusion through this digitization and how to increase beneficiaries' convenience through it. So there are challenges to achieving this vision, and these challenges are especially accentuated for women. And some of these challenges are achieving the coordination across government that's required. And it's very encouraging to see this series of webinars, which I think are a great forum to start discussing across government authorities. There's also the potential that the financial ecosystem doesn't fully support a modern G2P architecture, which I will explain in a moment. There could be some incomplete building blocks, especially when it comes to coverage of connectivity, mobile phones, access to ID, some of these key building blocks that we really need to reap the benefits of digitizing government payments. And there's also the issue of low financial inclusion, low literacy, digital capabilities, and just social norms that might be ingrained and that might require specific incentives to change. So now just moving on to the overview of what we consider a modern G2P architecture. So we have some design principles that we think about. The first one is not designing a G2P architecture only for a single program, but thinking about how to plug in multiple programs into a shared infrastructure. And this shared infrastructure can include several building blocks, such as ID, digital systems, central treasury systems, and others that we will explain in a bit. But the key part is that it should be interoperable and it should seamlessly support all these different programs. Then we need, as part of this architecture, the availability of choice of payment service provider to beneficiaries. And my colleague Sylvia will probably explain a little bit more from the case of Bangladesh in a bit, how powerful providing choice can be to achieve the development outcomes that we're after. And the choice should also be reflected on having numerous and widely accessible access points for beneficiaries. This is key to increase the convenience for beneficiaries. Another key point of a modern G2P architecture is receiving the payment in a fully functional account. And this is that beneficiaries can use the account not only to cash out, but also to have to make electronic payments, to receive and send remittances and transfers, to save. So it's important to have this different functionalities with the account that's provided, and also that beneficiaries can be onboarded to this account easily. So this includes having the necessary identification and documents to be able to open their account, and that the process is very simple for them. And finally, at the center of this architecture should always be the recipients, and their needs, barriers, gaps should be kept in mind when designing for the specific country. And as I mentioned, the objectives should be enabling government-wide fiscal savings, the recipient's welfare, and a third one can also be to spur innovation and private sector development. So, as I mentioned, as part of this G2P architecture, I just went through the design principles, and there are three pillars with the building blocks that underlie behind these principles that we want to achieve. So the first one is interoperable and shared infrastructure. And the building blocks here are the digital stack that we call the ID system, national payment system, and trusted data sharing together, supported by the country's connectivity. And some other three key building blocks here are the central treasury system and how it's connected to the national payment system. And the sectoral databases and systems. In the specific case of social assistance programs, what's relevant here is social registries, social programs, management information systems, among others, and an account directory that can map ID of beneficiaries and account numbers. The second pillar is enablers for accessible and choice-based G2P payments. And these are the building blocks that are related to the financial sector. And we'll go through them in a minute in detail. And finally, there are building blocks that are cross-cutting to the whole architecture. And there are inclusion and empowerment accelerators. And this include communication, literacy, consumer protection, grievance redressal, data protection, and gender lens, or a specific lens on the most vulnerable populations within the target population. And these are very important to be considered through the design of all the other building blocks as well. So just zooming in real quick on the interoperability and shared infrastructure to share some key characteristics that we should be focusing on. And maybe just let me go back for a second. I just want to mention this G2P architecture that we have here. This is the ideal scenario, but this doesn't mean that this is how it will look in every country. And it also doesn't mean that there will be a straight line to reaching this ideal scenario immediately. Each country, depending on the context, depending on the target population and the different recipients for various G2P payment streams, will determine what is the ideal for a given country. And with that vision, then you can plan on what should be the roadmap to reach that specific vision for the country. So what I'm going to present here in the characteristics of the different building blocks, this is the ideal scenario, and it doesn't mean that it's going to be the ideal specifically for South Africa, which would need to be tailored in this case. So for ID systems, it's important to have a strong and high coverage ID system that can uniquely identify a person, but most importantly, that they can digitally verify and authenticate a person's identity. And this includes having authentication services for financial service providers to be able to do this authentication, ideally even remotely, to facilitate onboarding of beneficiaries. And it's important that the ID system is interoperable with other systems, such as the national payment system and the sectoral databases, to be able to share data across. In the national payment systems, it's really important to have interoperability. And to achieve this, there must be RTD payments switches such as RTGS, ACH, card switches that can enable this interoperability. And ideally, that can also enable fast payments. It's important that payment switches are accessible to all payment service providers. This includes non-bank payment service providers that often are better placed to reach the lower income beneficiaries in some regions. Also, the standardization of processes within the payment systems is really important for the payments acceptance case. So when we're thinking about QR codes, for instance, it's important that there are standards in the country for acceptance of QR codes, so we don't end with parallel systems that can make the use of these instruments more difficult for beneficiaries, since it would limit the scope of places where they can use their account. And this is also important, and I'm underlining a lot here, interoperability, just because it will enable beneficiaries to use their account across several access points. Finally, pricing policies for office transactions should be reasonable, again, to enable beneficiaries to use, for instance, different ATMs from the ATM of their bank, and the integration of the public financial management system with the national payment system. And this can often include a single treasury account. That is a key element as well of how national payment systems and central treasury systems should be connected or interoperable. And as I said, data sharing and sharing of infrastructure is important across all these elements. And I'm not going into detail into every building block, but we can come back to them in the questions if you have any. Now, on the enablers for accessible and choice-based G2P payments, this is a financial sector building blocks. And when we talk about the business model with bank and non-bank payment service providers, here we're focusing on how we empanel payment service providers, or how we incorporate them into the G2P architecture to offer the payment services to beneficiaries or other G2P payment recipients. So here, what's important is ideally having several payment service providers in the architecture to give beneficiaries the choice of payment service provider. Second, it's important to have a level playing field among providers, and this applies to the contract criteria, as well as the fees and other specific service level agreements that are agreed with them. It's also important to have a fee or incentive structure for payment service providers that allows them to cover their costs and earn a profit. And this is important so it can be profitable to them, and ideally it can incentivize the expansion of access points, and it can guarantee the level of service that's needed for recipients. And information exchange with bank and non-bank payment service providers is also important, and it can take different ways, but what's important is to receive information on when payments are made to beneficiaries at least, and what are the grievances presented by beneficiaries. On the distribution networks and access points, I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but what's really important is that to ensure that the payment service providers that are part of the G2P architecture have a wide net of access points. And this usually includes thinking about agent regulations in the country, and making sure that they are enabling and that they can help expand this agent or access points for beneficiaries. For example, allowing for non-bank agents in some countries, having agent aggregators has also helped in other contexts, simplified agent onboarding, and service provision beyond cash out as the services that can be offered by agents. Liquidity should also be ensured, and that's something that has to be considered when deciding which payment service providers should be used, as well as the interoperability of these agents for the convenience of beneficiaries. In terms of account and payment instruments, as I mentioned earlier, it's really important that accounts are fully functional accounts and that allow for different financial services and payment services to be done with them. And the account opening process should be simple. This could be having a simplified KYC framework in the country that can simplify the account opening for beneficiaries, or it could also be leveraging the information in social registries to pre-populate some of the account opening information and make it easier for beneficiaries to open accounts. So there are different approaches that can be considered, but what's really important is to consider what will be the journey for the beneficiary to open accounts and how the program administrators can make that easier for them. Payment instruments should be offered alongside the account. This is having either a card or a mobile wallet that can be used to make payments. And these payment instruments should be interoperable, so they're able to provide and for payments acceptance networks, as I mentioned earlier, it's really important to think about not only opening accounts for beneficiaries, but how to create that ecosystem where beneficiaries can actually use their account and reap those benefits of having their money safely in an account and making it easier for them to transact. So when we think about payment acceptance network, it's important to think about how to incentivize the acceptance of electronic payments for transactions that are usually done by beneficiaries. So those merchants that are usually frequented by beneficiaries, how can we incentivize them to accept electronic payments? And the World Bank has some guidance on payments acceptance networks that it will be published very soon. Finally, on the inclusion and empowerment accelerators, communication strategy and financial literacy are critical, especially when introducing choice into the model. It's very important to make sure that beneficiaries understand the process of opening an account, what are their rights, and how to use their account. And for this, the financial education or training should be very focused to the needs of the beneficiaries and should be embedded directly into existing G2P programs. And there's a toolkit from the World Bank on how to incorporate financial education into G2P programs. And for communication, it's important to be consistent and use a variety of channels to make sure that you're reaching all your target population, including low and no literacy target audiences that might need different kinds of messages, not only written messages, to be able to understand their rights and the process that they need to go through. When it comes to consumer protection, monitoring and grievance redressal, it's really important to have a recourse mechanism and that the grievance response is clearly defined across the different stakeholders in the G2P architecture. And again, this can take different ways, including an ombudsman or having the financial sector receive the grievance as the first instance, and then communicating these grievances to the program administrators. And we can go a little bit more into the different arrangements that can be done. And payment reconciliation information is really important. So funds can be traced from origin to recipients, as well as continuously monitoring the needs and characteristics of beneficiaries to make sure that the architecture is still working for the population and it's considering all the different gaps and needs in there. And one specific lens, as I mentioned, was thinking about women specifically and how the design might exclude them or include them. And for this, we should consider that there are gaps in ID access, mobile phone access, account access, as well as different social norms that could be part of a barrier to accessing payments when going with certain digital payment solutions. So something to keep in mind when designing. And this is just an overview on how the different elements can come together, including the central treasury system being linked to the national payment system and incorporating different payment streams, not only social assistance payments, but thinking more broadly into how other government payment streams such as business to government, government to business, person to government, such as taxes or others, should be considered within the same framework. And again, I'm just giving an overview right now, but we can go deeper into it later if there's time. Kathy, I just want to check in with you to make sure that we still have time to quickly go over this section. If not, maybe we can leave till the end, since our colleagues are already going to present some examples from Indonesia and Bangladesh.
That would be great, Georgina, if we can just maybe leave it for the end. Let's see, I think it'll be good to cover it if we can, but let's just see how we do with time. So thank you very much. That was actually very exciting, and I know incredibly challenging to try and present such a complex topic in a very short space of time. So I don't think we've done you any favors by keeping the time so short. But I mean, I think for me, sort of the big takeaways around financial inclusion and economic empowerment and making sure that it's convenient for the recipient, but also the savings for government. And as we start to think about data interoperability through the process and through each of the channels, I like that it is a roadmap at the end of the day, and we can decide where we are on that journey and where we can move to. I think digitizing and technology is really a discipline about how we remain very agile, and I think that there are big lessons for government to learn as we try and put these new measures in place. So thank you, and I'm sure we're going to have lots of questions from the audience. Sylvia, over to you, presenting on Bangladesh. If you can just give us a little bit of a background about yourself in a few words, and then you may proceed with your presentation. Thank you.
All right. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
All right. And I'm also trying to share my screen, and somebody else is still sharing, so I can't share right now my screen. Now I can. Okay. Thank you very much. So I'll just make sure I have the right one. Can you see the presentation? Just to make sure that it's all working.
We can't see your screen yet.
Not yet, no.
Can.
Just try sharing again, please, Sylvia.
Okay, I'll try again. Let me see. Let me just, sorry, move those things around. It's too many windows.
Yes,
We can see it now. Great stuff. Thank
Wonderful.
You, Sylvia.
Excellent. All right. So yeah, hello, and thank you also for having me. I'm Sylvia Bauer-Jasbeck, and I'm a financial sector specialist at CGAP, which is a financial inclusion think tank that is housed at the World Bank. And before working with CGAP, I've worked for a couple of other development agencies and mostly focused on financial inclusion and on microfinance. So as one of the examples, I'm presenting the model of a more citizen-centric payments model from Bangladesh. And this is really something that came out of a discussion that we had with the government of Bangladesh in 2016. And they were curious to learn from us what are the most recent experiences and examples of G2P payment systems that really put the citizen at the center. And there was a little bit also of influence from what was happening in India. So we ended up partnering with the Better Than Cash Alliance and also with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to help the government of Bangladesh to do a deep assessment of their existing G2P payments landscape. And we developed a roadmap for them to modernize and to make it more citizen-centric and more efficient. And within the government of Bangladesh, we work specifically with an initiative called A2I, or Access to Information. And this is a cross-government agency that seeks to improve and digitize government services. And that
Sylvia,
is also,
sorry,
yes?
Are you moving slides? Because nothing's moving on our side.
No, not yet.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
But I gotta start off now.
Great,
So,
that's good. Thank you.
as we started off then working with A2I, the starting point was really the insights that we had from a recipient research exercise. And more specifically, we did a journey mapping with them. And what we found is that recipients' experience with the G2P payments process was marked by a variety of challenges. So after applying for the benefits, they often don't know whether they have been accepted and when they will receive their payments. Then when collecting their allowance card, there is very weak verification of beneficiaries, which offers opportunities for fraudsters. And then when they go to collect their payment, they may not be able to withdraw their money right away and during the first visit, but they need to return another day, then they need to wait in line. We found out that they wait an average 140 minutes to access their payments. And on top of that, they spend considerable money on transportation to get to the closest bank branch. And so based on these insights from the customer survey, but also a deeper assessment of their payments landscape, A2I developed a vision for what their new G2P payment system should be. And one of them was really that they wanted to have more direct payments that come from the government and go directly into citizens' accounts. They also wanted their new G2P payment system to be reliable and offer convenient access for citizens at the access point of their choice. And they wanted also access to a recourse system. Then they wanted citizens to be able to choose the provider and the account where they want to receive their payments. And they should be able to easily switch providers. And lastly, G2P payments should be cost efficient for the government, of course. And they also wanted to have one single system, a unified payment system for all the G2P programs. And just as a bit of background, in Bangladesh, there are over 100 different G2P programs. And then I also want to mention a last point, which is that they wanted a situation where a G2P program is not reliant on a single provider, but where they can leverage the whole market and also stimulate competition. So with this vision as our ultimate goal, and Georgina mentioned that as well, like that it's a vision that you have that is ambitious. You then take this vision and you translate it into principles against which you would vet different design options for the new G2P payments architecture. And in the case of Bangladesh, the principles included that, first of all, the new architecture would focus only on the payments part. That means it would focus on things like, it would not cover things like the design of the benefits, the targeting criteria, and any other non-payment services. That would remain with each individual program. Then the new architecture should allow any program to plug in and to participate. The new architecture should also build on the existing infrastructure. They didn't want some new infrastructure to be built, but really leverage what was there, including a payment switch that was there, digital ID system, and really only build new pieces of infrastructure for things that don't yet exist. And then the vision was to build incrementally towards that vision over a 5-year time period. So with these principles in mind, we worked together as a team, and we also had a consulting firm that supported this effort and developed and reviewed a variety of different scenarios or options for this new architecture. And lastly, we decided on a final architecture. And in the following, I will show you what this final architecture looks like that A2I wanted to pursue. So we start, of course, with the citizen experience, because as I mentioned before, for this vision of A2I, it was really important that we improve the experience for the citizens. And Georgina also mentioned this is also essentially about the experience that recipients have. And so we started really from that point. And what did we want the citizen experience to be like? First of all, the payment from the government is sent to the citizen's account. And in that moment that it is sent to his or her account, she receives a mobile text notification that her money was deposited. And then she would be able to go to her preferred financial access point. This can be an agent, can be a bank branch, an ATM, or a post office. And then she authenticates herself. In this case, the ambition was that this would be through a fingerprint reader, and she receives her money. So to make this transaction work, the new architecture relies on a couple of pieces of infrastructure, which is the national payment switch and the existing national ID system. And then in addition, we needed one more piece of infrastructure, which is a directory of recipients' ID number, their account details, and their phone number. And we call this a mapper. And you might remember from the presentation from Georgina that this is also one piece of infrastructure that she mentioned there. So how would then everything work on the back end, given these different pieces of infrastructure? We start first with how recipients would go about opening their account at the financial service provider that they choose. So they go to the financial service provider, and the financial service provider opens an account for them. In this case, we specified this to be a basic account product with 0 costs and fees for the consumer. And also at the moment of opening the account, the bank would take the biometric information from the recipient, in this case, the fingerprint, and verify their identity through the national ID database. Then once the account is opened, the recipient would then request the financial service provider to link this account and her phone number in the mapper. And at the same time, the programs would add recipients' ID numbers to their beneficiary database. And what happens then later on, and you will see that in the following slide, is that really the payment is later made just towards the ID number, and programs no longer have to have the payment details from their recipients. So they really just need the ID number. So then how does the payment work? So first of all, as I just mentioned, the program initiates their payment, and they submit the payment amount and the national ID number to the mapper for each of the recipients. Then the mapper would link the NID number with the respective account information and pass that information to the national payment switch. And with this, the switch would then process the payment, pulling the funds from the government program's account and transferring it to the citizen's account at her chosen financial service provider. Then finally, I'll show you what needs to happen when the citizen will go to get her money, and specifically when she goes to an access point of a provider that is not her account issuer. So she would need to authenticate herself at the access point through biometric verification, through her fingerprint. Then her biometrics are verified by the national ID system. And if they are positive, she'll be able to get her money while the payments switch initiates a fund transfer from the recipient's account to the account of the provider that is managing the access point. So this was the architecture, and then we developed a roadmap, as I mentioned, and we identified concrete actions for A2I, as well as other important stakeholders. And without going into detail here of how the different stages were laid out, let me just share that these 3 phases were really thought to be incremental, and that in a first phase, the objective would be to connect the existing infrastructure and to demonstrate that these payments can be made through a basic interoperable system and with biometrically verified payments. And we want to do that, first of all, with just a few G2P programs and with a few interested providers. Then in the second phase, the objective would be to address any of the shortcomings that would be encountered during the first pilot, and then expand the model to include more programs and also include more providers. And then in the last phase, which was really for years 5 and 6, the objective would be to scale it up to include all government programs, to reduce also the service fees, and then link beneficiaries with other financial services and take advantage of the opportunities to advance financial inclusion. So then let me just give you an update on where this initiative is now. As I will mention also in my next slide, these efforts are really ambitious. And also Georgina mentioned this is about developing a vision. And so it's a slow process. And to achieve the final outcome, it really requires commitment by many parts of government. And it also requires a champion within government who has the capacity and the power to drive this. A2I was successful in that they were able to launch a pilot in 2019, and they were able to test key aspects of the design, such as customer choice, the involvement of multiple programs, and they were able to build and test the newly developed mapper, and were able to route payments directly from Treasury into citizens' accounts. But also, as they started to implement the roadmap, they realized they had to make a couple of adjustments based on what was possible, given the political economy and given also the willingness of providers to participate. So they had to make a couple of trade-offs. For example, they decided that in the end not to leverage the national payment switch, at least for the short term, because it wasn't able to process biometric transactions. And it was more important to them to have biometrically verified transactions than using the national payment switch. What did that mean? They opted then to use the National Electronic Fund Transfer Network, which included only a selected number of financial service providers and also didn't allow for interoperability at access points, which means like recipients still don't have the ability to go to an access point that is not from their account. Let me then wrap up by summarizing what we've learned from the Bangladesh case. I think one important point is really that because the idea is driven by a government-wide initiative, A2I, and A2I has very strong support from the Prime Minister, they were successful in onboarding different ministries to join a unified payment system. We also learned that choice, even when it works technically, based on the architecture that we built, and even when recipients are well informed about it, it doesn't work unless there are multiple providers that have access points close to recipients' homes. So choice is still limited to the reach of distribution networks. And you heard that also in the prior presentation, that it's really important that also different service providers can offer their services close to recipients' homes and that we have the distribution networks in place. Then my third point is that the functionality of the mapper is dependent on the data quality of the national ID database. And that was something that they realized in Bangladesh, that there were a couple of failed transactions because the data quality wasn't very good. And then, of course, it's also important that you consider how many of your recipients actually have access to a national ID. And when you use a digital ID, do they all have access to a digital ID? So in Bangladesh, 5 to 8% of the beneficiaries don't have access to an ID. So you need to find a solution for them or make sure that they get access to an ID. And then lastly, we learned that when introducing choice, there obviously needs to be an incentive and a business case for providers to join, because you no longer make a single contract with a provider that you ask to go out there, open accounts, and provide payments to recipients. You really crowd them in. So there needs to be an incentive. And that is something that still needs to be figured out also in Bangladesh. But together with G2PX, we are also working on some guidance on how to identify a good pricing for G2P payments services. So let me close here, and I'm looking forward to questions after the next case study from Putra.
Thank you so much, Sylvia. That's very interesting and quite an exciting journey. I think South Africa is in a very similar position where we definitely need to have a champion for G2P payment system. And I think maybe one of our SASA colleagues can come in a bit later and tell us, I'm sure they have very similar challenges regarding some of the pain points that households actually feel when they apply for grants or individuals. Gede, over to you. Gede is from the World Bank. He's a senior financial sector specialist, and he's going to be presenting the case for Indonesia.
Thanks. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
All right.
Are you also going to be presenting, or are we putting up the slides for you?
Let me try to share the screen though.
Coming through. I can see your WhatsApp.
Sorry.
I can't see the slides. I can see your WhatsApp chat. There we go. That's it.
Can you see it?
I can see your slides now. You can just put them into slide mode. Awesome.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. So good afternoon, everybody. So let me just continue from what Georgina and Sylvia has mentioned before. So I guess in the case of Indonesia, it's almost like the government is implementing the broad principles that Georgina has presented before, but in terms of like the journey itself is not like that far from Bangladesh, because from the Indonesia case, they probably only started like 9 months now. It's not even a year. And I was mentioning by Sylvia before, this G2P digitizations is like a long-term kind of like engagements and process. And it requires a lot of political kind of like discussions within each of the line ministries, because coordination is really important. So in this sessions, I'm going to explain a bit the context of G2P in Indonesia and what is the current G2P mechanisms and architectures, and then what's going to be the dream for the future G2P implementations that hopefully can be implemented by 2024. So a little bit about the Indonesian situations at the moment. Indonesia is one of the most populous countries. We have a lot of peoples, and then from the government point of view, they're targeting the bottom 40%. But in reality, due to the large numbers of populations and also the budgets, they can only reach, I think, about 20% of the bottom populations. Now, in terms of the program itself, there are around 89 G2P programs that is being implemented by different ministries within the government. But in terms of the structure itself, maybe the simplest way to explain is by explaining some of these programs itself. So if you look at the third programs, the BST, that is the unconditional cash transfer, a very traditional one in which the government provided cash types of support to the beneficiaries, and the beneficiary will take it from the post office. So that's, we can consider it as G2P 1.0. Now the first and the second one, the PKH and the Sembako one, is the second generations of G2P, in which all the benefits is being transferred to account. The PKH one is the conditional cash transfer, while the Sembako one is the in-kind benefit subsidies provided to the beneficiaries. Now, the most recent one, I think the most advanced kind of like G2P programs is the Kartu Prakerja, which is almost incorporating the new elements of G2P, in which beneficiaries can choose the types of accounts that they want to get, the types of payment system providers that they want to get, and then they can cash it out in different types of channels. But in reality, all of these programs is not connected to one another. And then the main G2P 4.0 program is basically how all programs can be integrated into one systems, and then that can be implemented into the future. Now, specifically, if we're talking about the digitization programs, the government used the presidential regulations as the basis to kind of like set up the structures and also the mechanisms. Now, the current mechanisms and the structures as itself, it's kind of like everything is being decided by the programs, and it doesn't allow the beneficiaries to make any kind of a choice. So for examples, the government decides in which areas the banks that is going to be providing the account. And then the government only allow the state-owned banks to become the payment system providers to provide all types of services to the beneficiaries. In terms of the types of accounts, only bank account is allowed at the moment. So you can only open a bank account. And then the only types of instruments that they can choose is a debit card. So basically, in the end, the programs decided which banks that needs to be used by the beneficiaries. And then they can only use that in that only particular locations, which means you can only use that particular agents because the agents is not interoperable as of yet. ATMs, yes, you can use different types of ATMs, but using of us types of transactions will include fees. Bank branches, of course, if there's some branches available in that particular area. So in that sense, the beneficiary has a lot of limitations, and this kind of limitations bring some kind of like disbenefits from them. Now, in terms of like the payments process flow itself, like for example, if we have the Ministry of Social Affairs, they will informs the Ministry of Finance the list of beneficiaries that they're going to transfer, the amount of each of the beneficiaries that they're going to transfer, and then the account number of each of those beneficiaries. Then this information will be transferred to the central bank, in which the central bank will release the payments of the government, in this and is on behalf of the MOF, to these sponsor banks, which basically the state-owned banks, which are the only 4 at the moment. And then after that, the sponsor banks will do the intrabank payment transfers to the beneficiaries' accounts. Now, what are the challenges with the current systems? Particularly if you look at on the left part of the slides, I'm sorry, this is like very crowded, but the main issue is that one, because everything is being decided by the programs and the governments, they don't see the need for the beneficiaries to open their own accounts. So in that sense, in terms of the account opening process, all of the informations of the beneficiaries related to the KYC is being collected from the grounds and then being collected to the Central Ministry of Social Affairs, for examples, and then they will transfer that information to each of the payment system providers, one of the 4 banks. The banks then will pre-open the accounts, prepare the passbook and then the debit card. And then after that, they will send that passbook and debit card to each of the locations. And then the KYC process will happen at the latter stage, which is a deferred KYC kind of a process. Because of this kind of like long and then complicated stages involved, it becomes a massive headache in terms of like matching the consistency between the actual informations and then the passbook and debit card that is being sent there. So what really happens, like for example, we found many cards that is being transferred to the wrong locations because of manual error in terms of like submitting the information. So for example, if you are residing in the north, the card is actually being sent to the south or something like that. And that happens a lot. And then the second thing, when the beneficiaries do the KYC check at the latter stage, the information doesn't match with their actual ID card because it's being obtained by the facilitators and not by themselves. And then one very particular examples that is really bad is that in one locations, there are around like 65,000 of beneficiaries residing in that locations. Unfortunately, since the government is deciding to use one of the banks, and then that particular banks only have 1 ATMs in that particular locations. So there's no branch, there's no ATMs, and there's no agents. But there's only one ATMs that can be used by 65,000 of beneficiaries. So in that sense, it creates a lot of tensions. And of course, in terms of the ATM itself, it's frequently kind of like malfunctions in every 2 months. So these types of issues that are being raised for a couple of years has become a major headache for the Ministry of Social Affairs. And then from the Ministry of Planning itself, they want to improve this further. And that comes to the new concept of G2P 4.0. Now, in the G2P 4.0 concepts, what is being advised or being dreamed is basically the implementations of the principles that Georgina has mentioned before, and then the examples of the Bangladesh that Sylvia has mentioned before. But it really tailored according to the situations of the Indonesian case. So for example, the beneficiary now is giving the ability to choose whether they want to open a bank account or whether they want to open a mobile money account, whichever that is being more suitable for them. And then they also have the ability to choose whether they want to open a bank account at a state-owned bank, a private bank, or if they want to have a mobile money-based account, they can open it on their own using a smartphone and then have the types of instruments suitable to them. Now, of course, the elements of central mappers that has been mentioned by Sylvia before is also going to be very important to kind of like informs the program owners on which beneficiaries that is going to be getting which types of programs, and then the amount, and then all those stuff. And then from the interoperability point of view, the central banks working together with the payment associations and also with the industry, they're currently piloting the interoperability scheme, which will allow beneficiaries to use any different types of channels, whether that's going to be agents or ATMs, hopefully in 2022, using whichever instruments that they're going to use in the end. In terms of like the payments transfer itself, the difference is actually on the second and the third part, because now we have not just one sponsor banks that are going to do the intra-bank transfer, but we're basically having the state-owned banks act as a sponsor bank of the government. And then that state-owned banks can be the account providers, but they can also be the one that sends the monies to the other types of institutions. For example, the private banks or the mobile money providers. And with that, the beneficiaries can either use whichever accounts and whichever PSP that they want to get in the end. Now, for that to happen, there's a lot of things that needs to be fixed by the government, and this requires a lot of process. So in terms of the process itself, they started to do the roadmap development starting from like late last year to discuss each element that is going to be critical in terms of the implementations itself. The number one, of course, they need to improve and update the financial literacy programs, because now beneficiaries has the ability to choose. So they need to update that financial literacy modules and programs to make sure that beneficiaries now understands that they have an options to choose, but they also have the responsibility to open the account on their own, because now it's not going to be opened by the program itself. In terms of the account opening process, the proposal is to have it a decentralized account onboarding process, which means the beneficiary, once they've been notified by the programs, has the responsibility to either go to an agent, go to the branch, or using their smartphones to open their own account. Once they open their own account, they need to notify the payment system providers, in which these types of information will be stored in the central mapper. The central mappers will hold the information of the national ID number, the account informations, and also the types of programs that such beneficiary will be eligible. And then the fourth part is actually on the distribution benefit mechanisms. It's basically the elements of number 3 and 4 that I mentioned before, because initially you only have like one line of intrabank transfer, but now you have interbank and interbank options available for the implementations, but using an existing infrastructure. The fifth one that needs to be implemented is in terms of enhancing the interoperability, which means with using a single debit card, they can use different types of, they can just use it in different types of agents and different types of ATMs. The same thing with the mobile money. They would be able to use it in different types of agents and potentially ATMs in the futures. And then the next one is related to the cost structures assessment, because the current incentive structures is, how would I say, it's almost like the government doesn't pay anything to the state-owned banks in terms of providing the G2P payments distributions, because they will transfer the money 30 days in advance, and then they will ask the state-owned bank basically to use the funds in 30 days and get interest from it. And then the interest should be able to cover all the costs related to the distributions, which based on the analysis that we did like a few months ago, it basically doesn't add up and it doesn't cover all the costs. So this means that all of these elements of incentive needs to be changed. And then what is going to be decided by the government is basically two options. The first one is going to be a flat fee that is going to be provided to all the providers. The other one is going to be a zone kind of like fee types of provisions. So if one region is going to be very easy to serve in terms of like IT technology and then connectivity, then it's probably going to be close to probably zero in terms of like the incentive. But when it's going to be like very hard in remote islands in which you need like a ship or to basically go to that particular locations, then you will get a premium incentive in that sense. Now, the last part, which is probably more political than technical, is actually in relations to the monitoring and evaluation schemes. So in this one, there are two elements. The dashboard one is pretty straightforward, basically to monitor all the progress and all the elements of success, or if there's some failures in terms of like the executions. But the second part is actually to discuss about the clawback clause, because within the current regulations, particularly from the Minister of Finance, there's these regulations that once the money hit the account of the beneficiaries, the program owners needs to check whether the money or whether the benefit is being used by the beneficiary within 30 days. If it's not being used within 30 days, then the program owners needs to get the money back and return it to the government, because the assumption is that the beneficiaries doesn't need the assistance, or maybe he or she has passed away. So in that sense, this type of clause is actually prohibiting the use, basically the use cases for financial inclusions, which limits the welfare options for the beneficiaries. So these are the elements that is going to be implemented for the next 4 years now. So in terms of like the current progress itself, they've discussed the technicality and then the agreements up to the cost structures. And then pilot is going to be started towards the end of the year. On the other hand, the central bank has started the interoperability pilot since July, and then hopefully the infrastructure should be ready in 2022. But still, it's still a long way in terms of like implementations, full scale nationally. And then hopefully this is going to be fully achieved in 2024, which is part of the commitment from the government in the midterm development plans. I will stop here and then happy to answer any questions if you have in the next few minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's very exciting to see the developments, and also a nice link back to what Georgina has presented and also what was presented by Sylvia. I see there are a few questions, and then in the meantime, maybe if I can ask Chris Hamilton, who was the ex-head of BankServe CEO, if he can actually, I'm going to give you a few minutes, Chris, to prepare your thoughts. I know I'm putting you on the spot. Just in terms of your reflections of, you know, the next generation of G2P that you've seen, and maybe some comments on where you think the gaps are for South Africa. So Jason, do you want to maybe ask your question and we can have a discussion? I know Sylvia has responded, but maybe if we can discuss it. Jason?
Hello, Sam. Hi, Kathy.
Great.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Here too.
Sorry, I don't know if you can see me. My name is Jason Wang from Pausa. Yeah, so I had two questions regarding the sort of the criterias. The first question was regarding the criterias to participate. And this was actually around the thought of if programs can opt in and different programs can opt in, is there a way or sort of mechanism to ensure like a level of standard around that the service of G2P across the country? The second question, Sylvia has already answered, but maybe a follow-on question around that is around are there any mechanisms potentially to manage the SIM number churns? I don't know if that is something that's prevalent in Bangladesh, but also around potentially SIM swap fraud. Thank you.
Yeah, excellent questions. Thank you, Jason. So on the first one, during the exercise, we didn't specify what the criteria would be, but definitely from the experience in other countries, you do want to identify some criteria for providers to participate. So what we've seen in most of the countries that offer choice, they have some basic criteria that providers need to meet, especially with regards to things like actually fraud prevention, data security, data privacy and protection, also service level agreements. They are similar, right? So it's also about what type of services you offer to customers. It really depends a little bit on what you want to cover as a government, also with regards to recourse. Let's say if you decide that you want to have a centralized recourse mechanism for your recipients, then you would probably just have the requirement that providers plug into that system and are available to resolve issues that are related to their services. But if you say, well, we let providers resolve those things, then you also want to put that into those agreements or into these criteria. So what we could also do is, and I think actually Georgina and the G2PX initiative also has collected a couple of examples of service level agreements. We could share that as well and make that available just as examples. But I think it is really a case by case situation where you define within government and maybe even together with providers, what are the standards we want to adhere to. So in the example of Zambia, they have a working group together with the participating providers, and together they identified, well, these are the criteria that we want to adhere to together and commit to resolve. So maybe that on that side. On the program side, there wasn't much of a requirement. The requirement for programs is merely that they have themselves systems for their caseload management and for the program management that can link into the payments portal. So what they developed as well, and I think I didn't mention that, is a shared payments portal, as we would call it, which is a system or software that allows programs to initiate payments, and that would need to integrate with their own systems, although it can also work simply with uploading an Excel file that contains beneficiaries, names, IDs, and the amount that needs to be sent to them. So much to that question. And then with regard to phone numbers, yeah. So you had a question about churn rate and also fraud. I can't remember that we had a very deep discussion on that during the Bangladesh design, and probably also because initially they didn't yet look at the notifications. The SMS notifications are not enabled as of now. And it could actually be that this is one of the reasons that there is a high churn rate, of a high turnover of mobile phone numbers. Although I would assume that because SIM cards are now biometrically verified, there's a little bit less of that turnover. But I'm really sorry, I can't give you too much more information about that point. I would just say from the experience in other countries, and maybe Georgina or Putra know about another example. It's definitely something you want to look into. And I like the idea that you mentioned, that you also authenticate the user at the moment that they want to include their phone number into the mapper, right? So similarly, as you link your account to your ID number in the mapper, you might need to do that through a mobile agent, mobile network operator's agent, or access point, to also link your phone number in order to make sure that this is verified. I hope that answers your question.
Super, thanks. Mark, oh, sorry, Mark Brits, you have a question for Gedi? Mark?
Cassie, I think Mark has subsequently left.
Has he? Okay, great. No, thanks. Thanks so much, Audrey. Chris, over to you. Just some reflections on where you think we're going. And then Geeta, I'm going to also ask you to give us some reflections as the head of PASA.
Thanks, Kathy. Can you hear me okay?
Loud and clear, Chris. You can turn on your camera if that's okay.
I'll try, but often it interferes with the
Okay, that's perfect. I'll turn mine off as well.
It might be safer if I leave it off and then you make sure everyone can hear me.
Perfect. Go ahead.
So first of all, this is a very exciting series of lectures, and I think it's a wonderful initiative to be thinking in this holistic way about the future of benefit provision in South Africa and drawing on all these examples. The two we've had today have been very clear expositions of the specific solutions adopted in specific countries, and they highlight a couple of things. First of all, you really can pull out some big design best practice principles, because I think we can see a lot of commonality across both the two we saw today and the couple that were talked about last session. But also that none of these big design principles survive first contact with reality, you know. So in each case, there has had to be modification and adaptation and you know, practicality applied to make the benefit program work in the particular economy with its particular challenges and problems. And I think that those two ideas, that there are these important high design principles, but also that you have to practicalize at some point, that's really important stuff for South Africa as it goes forward. I want to talk about a few of what I think are the big design principles, if I may, just because it's great to try and draw them out while the examples are fresh in our minds. And probably the biggest one for me from what we've seen so far is what I would call the idea of componentization, or an open interface model, if you like, and where we can see that in each case, the designers have said, look, let's leave the organizations that are best qualified to deal with specific issues with those issues and try and take everything else away from them. So if you can make your interfaces fully open so that any program can join, any value store can be used, any access point can be utilized by the citizen, and indeed any payment instrument can be utilized, then you can try and future-proof the entire system new programs can come along, new payment methods, even new monetary frameworks. And I have partly in mind here the idea that we may all be looking at central bank digital currency at some stage in the future. And I don't want to go any further down that path because it's terrifying, but let's not forget that the world of payments is changing really fast too. So we can't design a point solution. So that idea of componentizing your design is a really powerful one, and you can go a long way with it, but it does carry some risks and issues. One of them is the risk of complexity to the citizen. So if you say to the citizen, yep, you know, we now have this integrated system, but you have to go and get your own bank account, and or you have to have your own access mechanism, and possibly even you're responsible for making sure that your data is up to date in the mapper. Those are big things to ask of communities where there isn't a lot of financial education. And so this is one of the points where practicality really enters into it. It may be that that's a great design principle, but we have to simplify the proposition for the citizen very carefully, and perhaps bring that fullness into the equation slowly. And of course, a corollary is that financial education, which has been mentioned several times, becomes critically important here. So I think that's a really powerful idea, but we need to manage it with care. The other thing I'd like to point out is that the role of the mapper becomes absolutely crucial, to state the obvious, and that it's likely to be a repository of more information than just ID, mobile phone, account. And over time, it probably needs to be designed to be expansible in principle, because it's likely to add other elements of information that are relevant. And that leads to another problem, which is how is the mapper kept up to date? And we haven't really heard a lot of discussion about that yet today, probably because of time. I'm sure that the people designing these programs have thought carefully about how you keep the mapper information up to date, how you keep those connections live and sensible, because that becomes the big burden in all of these sort of designs. And indeed, whether at some stage in the future, you can empower the citizen to have more influence over their own data and to be able to, for example, through a smartphone app or a wallet, actually know what the mapping for them is, and perhaps even have the ability to ask for changes. Those are the sorts of design things that you might think about down the track. One of the things that's really great about this design approach, of course, is that you can build the benefit system into the broader payment system and allow for financial inclusion uplift over time. And I think that's really important to keep in mind. It has been talked about a number of times in the sessions already. But what always happens, of course, is that we get focused on delivering a specific practical outcome, and the bright idea and grand idea of full financial inclusion gets put to the back a bit. But with designs like this, you have the opportunity, I think, to add in additional financial service providers connected to the mapping and to the identity of the individual, so that they have the opportunity to choose and benefit from broader financial inclusion. And that's a really exciting idea. Look, the last thing I want to mention, Kathy, and I hope I'm not going on too long, is that the public-private balance here becomes very important. And again, it's been talked about a few times, what is done as a public good. And most people would agree probably that the national ID system is some kind of public good and is unlikely to be privatized. But then what can be done on a commercial service provision basis in partnership with the government, and we've seen examples where the store of value service is being done at least semi-commercially. And getting that interface right, and therefore designing the right incentives for the private sector to play its role, becomes a really important element of the design. And I think different countries will have different approaches here. It may well be that something which can be left successfully to the private sector with the right incentive mix in one country will have to be a public good in another country, just because of the differences in services and infrastructure and the evolution of their financial sectors. That's probably more than enough, but there's such a lot you could talk about here. We could go on for a long time, but let me hand it back to you, Kathy.
Thanks so much, Chris. And those are very useful insights. I like the way you've broken it down, and I certainly agree. The mapper is quite critical on where it's located and what kind of information is held. And, you know, maybe we can, once Geeta has commented on that, we can maybe ask Sylvia and Georgina and Gedi to actually address some of those questions. As soon as Geeta's finished talking, Caesar will address your question where you can actually ask Gedi directly around how they've, you know, identified families. Geeta, over to you.
Thanks, really appreciate the opportunity. And I must say I agree with Chris, this is an incredibly exciting conversation and a great opportunity for the country. So delighted to be part of it, and thank you to the organizing team. So the thing that struck me most out of the two examples that were discussed today, and particularly relating to Sylvia, the Bangladesh discussion, is this concept of putting the beneficiary at the center and the concept of choice. So there are a number of results that fly from that arise from that approach. But what became very clear in the conversation is that in allowing the beneficiary choice, you increase your reliance on interoperability. And that is very powerful in that it allows you to reuse existing infrastructure in much broader environments. So the issues that were spoken about there aren't enough ATMs, there weren't bank branches, people didn't have choice, they had to travel in order to be able to withdraw their money, all of those start to fall away. So the choice and interoperability are clearly and absolutely linked. What's interesting, though, about this particular interoperability discussion is that it's broader than what we would traditionally consider interoperability. So it talks about, and the trade-off that we heard in the Bangladesh example between biometrics and interoperability. Now, ultimately, that shouldn't be a trade-off, and we'll get to how the incentive models potentially impact that piece. But the point is that we have to think in a broader way about interoperability. So interoperability about form factor and authentication mechanisms in order to create the choice and the breadth of the network that we want to be available to the beneficiary. With the other obvious one that came through very clearly in particularly the Indonesia example is around the need to have interoperability between bank accounts and mobile stores of value. So we're starting to see, as I said, a much broader definition of interoperability than what we would traditionally deal with today. I am a firm believer, as those of you who've spent time with me would know, that the payment system can create interoperability between different stores of value as and when needed. And that talks again to the reuse that we see of the existing national payment system infrastructure. But critical in all of that, and particularly if you're expecting people to build or create infrastructure, so whether it's biometrics or additional interoperability, is the incentive or the compensation model. And that inevitably goes with some of the discussions around interoperability. I think that it is quite clear that an interest model is never going to make up for transactional costs, particularly not when you're dealing with the costs of physical cash. So obviously real thought needs to be put into how that element will work. So I think that whole element of choice, interoperability, and how it ties into compensation models is quite critical. And all of that has the beneficiary at the center, which, as I say, is the bit I love. There's some very interesting program design elements that come through in this conversation. So the point about project ownership or program ownership is absolutely core to all of this. Because without that, you can't get to the centralized infrastructure, the plug and play concepts, which Chris touched on as well. So the ability for anybody who wants to use, within government, who wants to use that central infrastructure to be able to plug into it. And implicit in that also is, again, the same concept we've talked about in interoperability, which is reuse. So when I look at these case studies, and particularly the Indonesian, the Bangladeshi one, what I find incredibly important is to say, where are we today? What does our national payment system already offer? And how can we string these pieces together with minimal infrastructure build? The one piece that I think everybody's touched on and is clearly core to the infrastructure build is the concept of the mapper. And I think that Chris has talked very eloquently and substantially to that. The other elements that came out very strongly for me, and my previous experience in having done big digital projects would support this, is the incremental approach. So we're not trying to do everything in one go, but with that, buying yourself the ability to have some agility and adaptation, because as you build each small piece, and again, to Chris's point that the plan never survives the interaction with the real world, you at least have given yourself the opportunity to adapt to the plan as you go. Obviously, core to all of this is the financial education and the idea that you start off with the vision and the principles. I guess the hardest question in some of it is the trade-off question. So when you hit the real world, what trade-offs are you prepared to make around your design and your principles? And I think that is where the real complexity is sitting. But in summary, I really think this is a great conversation. I love the approach that we're taking, and I look forward to more conversations about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Geeta. Caesar, could you ask your question? And then Portia, if you can ask your question to Sasa. We've got Fani, and if I'm not mistaken, we've got Karen Costa, and we've got Caesar from Sasa who can potentially sort of shed some light on some of your thoughts. Caesar?
Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks. Yeah, my question was basically to the colleague, I think it's Gete from Indonesia, who showed various figures in terms of the number of families that are benefiting from their various programs. And the question was actually, how do they define a family? Because in South Africa, I think these benefits are to individuals, and to say that if you have that concept of a family, how do you actually authenticate a family? How do you make sure that, you know, this individual doesn't end up belonging to various families and double dipping? Thanks.
Get over to you. And if you can also answer the earlier question that was asked by Mark Brits. He just said, government has introduced moral hazard, expecting the banks to invest the grant money for 30 days to make enough money to cover the costs of processing the grants. You were talking about an advance payment that was actually made. I mean, there are different ways of doing it. You know, SASSA historically, and maybe Karen can chat to it, you know, used to advance monies, whereas now they try and use a more just-in-time process. But if you can guide us a little bit, thanks.
Sure. I mean, I fully understand about the moral hazard issues, but the problem is that it's being stated in the presidential regulations as the way to get basically the incentive to cover all the costs, and which is also one of the reasons why we kind of like suggested to change that and make it more transparent, because in the end, we don't know what's the actual cost of that. And I think it would be much, I would say, fair if the government pay based on the price. But I think from the Ministry of Finance point of view, when they made that decisions is because by doing that, they basically don't pay anything to the state-owned banks, because it's basically a free service. And then they can even add up like by saying, you also needs to implement the financial educations, you also needs to do this, it also needs to do that, and that should be covered by the 30 days float basically. So in that sense, it's more political in terms of like technical, as I mentioned before, which is practically the elements of G2P when we discuss it further. Now, going back to the family concepts, yes, of course, this is being one of the challenges. And I think to make it even more complicated, if you see my presentation before, we have 89 programs that has no central kind of like connections between one program to another. So in terms of like double dipping, in terms of like duplications, it's very common to happen with this along the years. So which is why the vice presidents, I think in 2018 or 19, were suggesting for these reforms, which basically now all the programs is required to use the national identity number as the unique identifier, which is not being used before. And then I think the most drastic kind kind of like decision made by the Minister of Social Affairs like a few months ago is basically she deleted like 2/3 or 80% of the program beneficiaries' informations, because she requires moving forward that unless the beneficiary has the NIK, the national identity number stored in the registry, then they're not allowed to get the benefits. So moving forward, the use of ID as the identifier for each of the beneficiaries is going to be critical. But at the moment, it's basically kind of like a mess for now. I hope that's clear.
Thank you very much. That is very useful. Fani, maybe if you can respond to Portia's question. Portia, do you want to maybe ask your question?
Thanks, Kathy. I think Chris and Gita did talk to it, but I would love to hear how SASSA views the entire thing, especially the Bangladesh story from their side.
Fani, not to put you on the spot again, but thank you.
Okay, good afternoon, colleagues. I think my comments on the Bangladeshi scenario, it was as if Portia was seeing what I was writing down, because I indicated that the SE's assessment looks exactly like the case for SASSA, specifically not for the SRD 350 system, but for the normal social grants. So there is a bit of similarities in that particular space, but just to indicate that the key lessons that one has taken off from the Bangladeshi presentation is that I think what they are saying is there's got to be a champion for GDP payments. There has to be persistent in terms of trying to improve these particular systems. But I think the other element is build it one block at a time, as it was indicated by
Arnie, have we lost you?
Yeah.
Sorry, I lost you for a second. Go ahead.
Yeah, the Indonesia case for me, I think what I liked a lot, or what I picked up there, was the new architecture for Indonesia. I think he termed it G2P 4.0, because in the take-home points that I had was they are wanting to expand the instruments of payments. And for me, you'd understand, at the moment, all SASSA clients are carrying a card, but how best does a I think there was a little bit of an interesting point that I've taken from that story, but it was also their eKYC, because many people don't know that we are wanting to have clients coming to us face to face, because I think possibly there is some lessons that we have to learn, so that we can be able to also expand or move over to eKYC for those clients that are a little bit younger. Because of course, a social grant beneficiary today who is in our system is not somebody, those that are receiving child support grant, they are almost of the same age groups, and they are majority of our beneficiaries. But the other key part is the cost structure, which the colleagues in Indonesia were talking to. You'd recall our system at the moment, we're subsidizing the one group, but we have a particular group of clients that we are not subsidizing. But of course, I think if the instruments of payments expands, it could also be a driver for us to look at how best we look at the cost structure and the extent on which we can review our subsidization model. But the first presentation that was done, it was also an interesting part, because I think what is coming stronger in the presentations that we've had last week and what we came today, this issue about the national ID system, the ID systems, and the extent on which the national ID is being utilized. The relationship between the national ID and biometric, the extent on which the national ID that has got biometrics embedded or attached is utilized to verify, authenticate the payments. I think it was a key point. Interoperability, I think we had it last week. It was a key talk. Today is coming even more stronger to an extent that it is starting to prick the central bank, the role of government on ensuring that G2P systems becomes a reality in the country. So I think those are some of the key points that I was able to catch from the discussions that we got. But there was another point around account opening being made simple. Payment instrument should be linked and be simple to access. So there was a lot that one picked up, which I was listening from an ear of a beneficiary. How best do we make life easy for a South African social grant beneficiary? Thank you.
Thanks so much, Fani. I see Abram's got his hand up from SASSA. Go ahead, Abram.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I just wanted to add on a few things that Fani has said, and thank you for the presentation. My understanding really from this presentation is that G2P changes the entire ecosystem in terms of the following. That's my understanding, that the flow of funds seems like it's going to change. The flow of funds, and I'm talking the flow of big money, to the extent that it suggests that the role of SASSA and the department may have to change. Because if it is government to people, then it means some middlemen in the architecture of the value chain of payment of grant is going to change. And probably there will be policy implications there. And I'm glad my colleagues from DSD probably are in the audience. Secondly, I wasn't 100% sure, maybe I missed it. What was the role of the telco companies so far as access and data costs are concerned? Did they come to the party in terms of making a contribution, or it is going to be one other exclusion measure where only people that are actually able to access internet and technology through being closer to, access in terms of the infrastructure and also the gadgets they use. What was the role of the mobile, telco companies? And thirdly, I think there's going to be quite an extensive discussion that must ensue with regard to data ownership and data storage and protection thereof, because this value chain suggests that the banks, in a way, are going to be part of this thing called national payment system is going to be redefined in a way that says who is actually the core, host, as it were, of this data. We may originate the data as SASSA because we interact with the people, but beyond that point, what is going to happen? How is the protection of data and ownership thereof? I know to explain and say the ownership of data resides with the data subject, which is a person. But beyond that, once the data is transacted, it becomes another discussion. It's no longer necessarily the ownership of the ownership is no longer, with the data subject. And lastly, if I understood well, then it seems like the policy of government benefit distribution will have to be reconsidered in a very detailed manner, right? Not only for SASSA because it's social assistance, but the rest of government benefit distribution is going to be affected by this particular model. And these are the insights that I got from the presentation. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Abraham. I'm going to open up to Georgina and then to Sylvia, who's actually got her hand up, and then maybe to Gede. But in the meantime, is Brenton still on the line? Brenton, are you here or have you left? I don't see him. He might have actually left, but because it would have been great to hear from DSD. Georgina, from your perspective, I mean, we've heard quite a bit about the mapper, right? And I suppose so maybe some of your thoughts from a governance perspective, because the mapper is not just a link between just the ID number, a mobile number, and the bank account, sorry. It's actually broader than that, right? I mean, as Chris said to us, it could potentially carry other pockets of information as well. And I'm curious, where is the mapper normally located? I mean, we've seen definitely, Sylvia indicated from the Bangladesh perspective, it looks like it's located at the Ministry of Finance. Indonesia seems to be a similar story where that kind of file also is processed through the Ministry of Finance. But just from your thoughts around where, this mapper is and how important it is to keep that information updated. And then also, because digital identity is such an important part, linked to the interoperability of information and how it's processed, how do you get around things like permission to access that information? Where governments need to prevent the double dipping, we heard from Gede. Double dipping is a big issue. If you've got 89 programs and you're looking at families, unless you're verifying and authenticating information and making sure people aren't double dipping, how do you address some of those challenges that sit in the environment, specifically from a payments perspective? And then I suppose the second point really is around the payments journey. I mean, you're in a G2P space, you're coming up with innovations around payments. We saw in the Bangladesh case that this has taken like 5 to 6 years. What is sort of like the average journey of some kind, and it is a long-term intervention, we understand that, but is it like 10 years, is it 20 years? Obviously, I think we're trying to say in a digital world, let's do things incrementally. That's Gita's point and Chris's point, let's be adaptive. Let's not, try and create everything up front and create this beautiful plan and then kind of, I'm on a sailing course at the moment, and you have to constantly adapt, otherwise you're going to sail to the bottom of the sea. So let's not do things like that. So some thoughts from you, and then I'm going to open up to Sylvia as well. I think she might have wanted to respond to some of the other comments, and then maybe some comments from Gede.
Thank you, Kathy. And it's great to hear the discussion that we're having, because there are very relevant comments and questions as well. And the challenges that many of you are stressing are definitely what several of the countries that we work in are facing as well. So there's not a silver bullet, and maybe let me tackle first the payment journey question, because it's a very relevant one. I think it's important to underscore how this kind of changes don't happen overnight. And that's why coming together, all the different stakeholders and thinking what is that ideal vision is important as a first step, but also thinking what are the sequential steps that can be taken to get you there. And that might look like having maybe just a couple of payment service providers in the short term, but making sure that the arrangements that are put in place are not going to become a barrier down the line to reach that vision that you've jointly decided should be the vision for South Africa. So in terms of timeline, there's no straight answer for that. I'd say since it's an organic process, it can take, it looks very differently in every country. I know, for instance, in Indonesia, and Putra can talk more about this, they started to think about digitizing payments in 2016, finalized the digitization with state-owned banks around 18, Putra, correct me if I'm wrong, but now they're thinking about how to go to the next stage of their vision. And that again will take 4 or 5 years probably. So it's a sequential process. And I think the key thing here is not ever thinking that you've reached that ideal point, always monitoring what are the new needs in the context and making sure that you're responding to the beneficiaries or the recipients' needs. Now, on the question on the ID mapper, and I'm sure Sylvia will also have some ideas on this, there's no single guise in which an ID mapper comes. The crucial functionality that we need from it is indeed mapping IDs with account numbers or mobile money, mobile phone numbers. Now, this can be housed, as Sylvia said, with the Minister of Social Affairs. It can be housed independently. There are some cases where there's no mapper as such, but the national payment system, the central bank, for instance, maintains a mapping of mobile phone numbers and accounts, like in the case of Mexico. So all you need is that connection of those two databases, and it can be housed in different parts or look differently. And you don't need a mapper as such. What is key here is the underlying unique ID and high quality, high coverage of ID. And this was mentioned in one of the comments. It's critical to link the different databases. And I would say you don't necessarily need to think about adding more data points to your mapper, but rather thinking on how these different systems can become interoperable by having this strong ID, unique ID that links them on the back end, and that systems can speak to each other. So the mapper is kind of like a solution in the short term while you ensure that you have that system that can speak to each other, but it's not the only way to go about it. And in the question how to keep it updated and how to keep it alive, that is a critical question, especially when you consider that some beneficiaries have more than one account. So you want to give the option to beneficiaries to switch accounts, the preferred account. And that's something that can be thought about through the grievance process or with the Ministry of Social Affairs administering the program. So those are just some options, but maybe it'd be great to hear from Sylvia and Putra as well and their thoughts on this.
Super, Sylvia, and then Putra, I had rechristened you. Apologies for that.
All right, let me jump in here and I'll start with the question on the mappers. So as Georgina also indicated, the mapper doesn't necessarily have to be a database. It can be a system that links to different databases. So basically you just have, let's say, an interface, and that interface then has links to the information that comes maybe from a database from the central bank, and then information that comes from a national telco association or national telco regulator. So it doesn't need to be a database in itself. Plus, I would say you would not want to have too much more information than what is essential for these transactions, especially because of data security reasons. You don't want to create a honeypot. And I think that addresses also some of the other comments. I would just leave it here with regards to the mapper. And yeah, most of the times actually this is housed with the Ministry of Finance. Also in India, it's housed with the National Payments Corporation. I also would like to address again, like the levels of choice, and Geeta mentioned that, and then also to come back to something that Georgina mentioned. There are basically 3 levels of recipient choice that you can enable. The first one would be the choice of provider and of instrument or form factor, right? By choosing your provider, you also choose whether you want mobile money or whether you want a bank account with a debit card. So that's the first level of choice. The next level of choice would be that you can switch providers easily. And that is really what is enabled through that mapper. And then the third level of choice is that you can choose the access point and also go to access points that are not from your account issuer. And that is essentially what is enabled by an interoperable payment switch most of the times. Then I'd also like to mention briefly on the, and that addresses also the question about telcos, and that you don't want to create further exclusion. So if you offer different options, that there's also an option that that works offline and that is just based on a debit card, then you don't exclude people. Then my other point was on the champion, that you need a champion. And it's important that you have a champion actually that is maybe not only within the Ministry of Social Affairs, you also need a champion within that level, but ideally you have support at the high level management of government, because you need to pull in the central bank and financial sector regulators, like we mentioned EKYC, that often requires regulatory change. So you need to also get the buy-in from the side of the financial sector. And then the National ID Authority is involved. So that is why it's always been really helpful to get that strong support from a high level in government. My next point is on incentives. Geeta also touched on that. And this is indeed crucial, again, to come back to, we want to improve the experience for the customer. And for the customer to improve their experience, you need to remunerate well the delivery. Because if the provider doesn't get the money from you, the government, then they will try to get it from the customer. And that might result in a bad experience, that they're not very reliable operating hours, that they don't have sufficient liquidity, or that they charge unauthorized fees. And there are different options that we've seen. So for example, in Zambia, the government decided they will pay a top up to recipients, and recipients pay the regular cash out fee at their chosen provider. So here they stimulated more competition in the market through that, because the recipients, they choose the provider based on who has the lowest cash out fee. And so actually there was a reduction in cash out fees in the market. Then they also chose that option because they didn't want to have a contract with a provider. So they wanted to avoid procurement. And so they said, okay, we will not even have a contract with a fee. So we just pay to recipients a top up. Another interesting example is Kenya, where they have a tiered fee based on the remoteness of the access point where a recipient withdraws. And that again creates incentives to reach out into very remote areas. So we found that also very interesting, and you can learn more about those cases in the case studies that I linked in the chat. So then my last point was probably, sorry, I think that's actually it. So unless there are more questions.
Sorry, Putra, your last comments, and then we can hand over to Saul Muscat to actually close off the session from the presidency.
Thanks. Just a few final points from my side. I think what is really important and critical is the national commitment on this. So from the Indonesian case, the presidential regulations is the basis for everything. And in that regulations, they set up what we could call like the control team committee, which is being like an 18 ministry members led by the Ministry of Human Development. But in the end, the Ministry of Planning is the champions that take the lead. But it consists of the central banks, the Ministry of Home Affairs that basically controls the ID, the Ministry of ICT that responsible for the IT networks operations, and then implementing it in stages, for example, because in the end, what they want to do is reach all the urban kind of like settlements within 2-3 years, and then starts to expand within 3 years afterwards. And then the second thing is basically leverage on whatever infrastructures or whatever initiatives that is currently happening and is going to be implemented in the futures. So for example, in terms of the mappers, for the Indonesian case, there are two options. If we're using the existing infrastructures, that means we're using the Ministry of Finance, basically SPAN systems, which already use to pay the salary of the government employees. But this can be added, a new module can be added for the G2P. But what is going to be really important is the central bank's innovations in the futures, in which they're going to include the digital ID in the the new retail payments kind of like infrastructures that needs to be completed within 3 years. So they basically, I mean, the government basically agreed that it's much more makes sense to put this into the central bank. So basically, we don't need to invest a lot, use whatever that is available, tailor it to whatever that is suitable to the country needs. So I guess those 2 points are like my final points. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'm just going to read a quote and hand over to Saul. So it says, think of digital transformation less as a technology project to be finished than as a state of perpetual agility, always ready to evolve for whatever customers want next, and you'll be pointed down the right path. And so, Saul, from the perspective of the PMO, can I hand over to you to close off? Thanks so much.
I'll be very quick so that we can close soon, but perhaps just to firstly thank Kathy and the team for convening this this session and the webinar series as a whole. I think, you know, it's really rich and it's been very useful from our perspective. And also to thank everyone in the audience who's been able to join us for this. I think we have a really broad range of people from within the South African government and beyond. And it's exciting to see everyone engaged in this process. And lastly, and most importantly, thanks to all of the speakers who've joined us today. I think it was a really valuable session, looking at all of these constituent parts of what a modern G2P architecture would look like, from, you know, shared infrastructure and interoperability, how to enable programs across government to opt into that infrastructure, looking at giving beneficiaries choice, especially of payment service providers, and designing the system as a whole around the beneficiary's point of view. And I think as in the last session, looking at case studies of where this kind of work has been done in other contexts is really useful for us in South Africa. So without saying much more, I think we began this webinar series in the first session by looking at what a whole of government approach to G2P payments would look like in South Africa. And this webinar session and the subsequent sessions are really delving deeper into what that would actually take. And so I hope that everyone here will be able to join us for the next couple of sessions as we continue to do that, so that we can start to feel our way and chart our way towards you know, a transformative process in this space. So again, thanks to everyone for joining us and to the speakers especially, and hope that you'll be able to stay engaged as we go along. Thanks, Kathy.
Thanks so much, Saul. We're just going to put up the last slide and just say goodbye to everybody, and we hope to see you on the 6th of October. Enjoy the long weekend. Happy Braai Day, and stay safe, everyone, and we'll see you in 2 weeks' time. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks all.